Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, this evening. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Center on the Future of War, which is a partnership between Arizona State University and a DC-based think tank called New America. So we do a number of different things. Many of you are familiar with our work. We run research projects. We run an online master's degree in global security. We host a variety of different events in Washington, as well as at least used to be in person, now online. And so thanks for being here with us. This is the final talk in our fall speaker series. We're really thrilled to have Keith Mines join us. I'm going to pass the podium, so to speak, over to my colleague, Glenn Goodman, because tonight our event with Keith Mines is co-sponsored by ASU International Development. So we're pleased to be joined by Glenn Goodman, who will say a few words, and then I'll introduce Keith and we'll move on to the talk.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and thanks for the opportunity for us to co-sponsor this great event with the Center on the Future of War. The ASU International Development is a interesting endeavor that is pretty unique among universities. We are a business development unit that looks to marry ASU capabilities to international development challenges and get ASU faculty on projects with the USAID, Department of State, and other funding bodies. On the team, I'm a professor of Brazilian history or Brazilian studies at ASU. And on the international development team, I lead up our Latin America initiatives. So I currently chair the Central America Working Group, where we're kind of a cross-university endeavor to find what are the ASU capabilities and the ASU faculty who have expertise to help try and solve some of the problems that the current administration has identified as crucial points in the region. So when Daniel asked if we would co-sponsor the event, we were very, very happy to, because we also want to start increasingly do thought leadership and bring exactly the kinds of issues that Director Mines is going to talk about to the ASU community and think about what kind of innovative, interesting solutions that we can put together as the administration continues to try and solve some of these sticky issues in the region that all stem from what I'm sure that Director Mines will talk about under the framework of peacebuilding. So it's great to be here, and if anybody would like to get in touch and learn more about what ASU International Development is doing, please feel free to reach out to me or to the Center on the Future of War, and we can be put in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Glenn. So we're thrilled to be joined by Keith Mines, who is the director of the Latin America program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, something that Keith will talk about a little bit. Previously, he worked at the State Department, where he was most recently the director for Andean and Venezuelan affairs. In 32 years of diplomatic and military service, he's worked on governance and institution building in many places in Central America, Colombia, post-conflict stabilization in Haiti, Iraq, and Afghanistan, famine relief and tribal reconciliation in Darfur and Somalia, and a variety of other issues. He's written extensively on peace-building negotiations and the roots of civil conflict, and he's the author of a recent book, Why Nation Building Matters, Political Consolidation, Building Security Forces, and Economic Development in Failed and Fragile States. So his talk tonight is called Current Challenges in Peacebuilding in the Americas, Central America and the Andes. And just for those who are unfamiliar with these events, Keith will speak, and then we'll have a Q&A session, which I'll moderate. And for those interested in presenting some questions, please just type them into the Zoom question box, and we'll try to get to all the questions that you have. So again, thanks for joining us. And Keith, we're thrilled to have you here with us at ASU.
Right, well, thanks for the opportunity, Daniel and Glenn, and Matthew, thanks for sorting out all the tech stuff. It's a privilege to be here tonight, and what I thought I would do, given our title and the topic that we're addressing, I thought I would spend about half of my time on Venezuela, which is kind of just the most interesting thing going on right now, and then about a quarter on Colombia and a quarter on Central America. And then I'm also kind of conversant in Haiti if we want to talk about that in the Q&A. So a bit about USIP, if you're not familiar with the Institute. U.S. Institute of Peace was founded in 1984. It was the vision of a number of veterans of combat from World War II that were in the Senate and Congress. And frankly, a little bit frustrated that we spend so much on defense, national defense, and so little on peace building. So the idea was to have at least one government institute that focused exclusively on how to build peace and sustain peace once it is reached. It started out kind of as a research organization, training organization, and then eventually evolved into having field programs, which is what we have today. So we're about 200 employees, very small institute, kind of marginally funded, frankly, but have the capacity to do some field programs, and then a lot of research analysis and convening in Washington and abroad. So we have a mix of programs that go anywhere from local peace builders and youth and women community peace builders all the way up to nuclear policy and big power competition. So kind of a whole spread of things. We're coming out of the big programs in Iraq and Afghanistan now, and really kind of building out a stronger Latin America program, which is kind of new. We've been in Colombia for 15 years. That's been the flagship program that the Institute's had in the hemisphere. And we had one very dynamic officer from USIP, Ginny Bouvier, who actually died during the peace process as part of her service, or as part of her service, in the course of her service. Was very focused on the question, which will come up a little bit in the comments I have on Colombia, but the question of how do you involve everybody in the peace process? What about the outliers, the ones that weren't involved? In the case of Colombia, Afro-Colombians, youth, women, and other minority groups and dispossessed. So that was kind of her focus, and included that in the peace process. President Santos was quite seized with her work. So that's the legacy we had, was the Colombia program. We then began a program in Venezuela about 4 years ago. And Venezuela is a very odd case. It's not a shooting war per se, but it produces warlike indicators. 7 million refugees, hunger across the country, frankly, because of the collapsed economy and the political polarization. So kind of a gray area conflict. And that's why I actually find it quite interesting, because I think it's part of the new kind of conflict that we're going to be seeing more and more of. So that's Venezuela. We added also to our portfolio Bolivia and Nicaragua, kind of similar in the sense of very polarized societies where violence is often the first choice for solving political problems or frustrations. So part of our programs in those countries are trying to find ways to develop and evolve dialogue spaces where, again, violence is not the first recourse when there's a political dispute or frustration. So starting in with Venezuela, my trajectory with Venezuela has been about 4.5 years. People that work on Venezuela, we get kind of mildly obsessed because everyone feels like we can certainly fix this thing. There's got to be a way to make this work. So you get very committed people to it. I remain very committed, but it is a real tough nut to crack. It's really kind of harder than I think it needed to be, but many of these conflicts I think are. So just by a little bit of background, the way I look at Venezuela, and I think many of the experts that I follow look at it, is it's a hybrid regime. It started out, of course, as a wildly popular movement with Hugo Chavez. He won elections convincingly, resoundingly. There was no question about his ability to win elections legitimately. Very popular and remains popular. Chavez, oddly, has still got 60% approval rate, higher than any other leader in Venezuela by a very long shot. The next one down is about 12%. That's Maduro and Guaido are both down in the low teens. So, the whole thing starts as this very popular movement, but it was a polarizing populism that he brought to the country. And some very good BYU professors have done a good study on polarizing populism and kind of what that does, how leaders lead that way. And I think it's something that's important because we're seeing it more and more now in Central America and other places. So Chavez, there are a couple of seminal moments, of course, in his career. He survives a coup in 2002, barely survives it, but there was some mix-ups in how things were done. But it really kind of drove him in the direction of rebuilding the security forces and building out a regime that was kind of coup-proof. And that was one of the things that has made his regime so resilient. And even as he passed it on to Maduro, again, it retained a lot of that resilience. And I mention that because there's a number of things built into that regime that just make it difficult dislodge or to displace. And I think that outsiders have often been a little bit naive about the price that it would have to be paid to dislodge a regime like that. Again, I think we're going to see more and more of that. So there's some interesting lessons, I think, for the hemisphere and even further abroad. So Maduro, Chavez dies of cancer in 2013. Maduro takes over. Maduro has turned out to be far more clever and resilient than anyone thought. And he is actually, I think, politically very astute. He comes across a bit buffoonish, frankly, but it's not him really. He does have a good political sense, and he has not only inherited that apparatus from Chavez, but he's been able to improve on it in the areas that mattered to him retaining power. So U.S. strategy in Venezuela for quite a while has been to try to turn them back to democracy, at least for the last into the middle of the second Obama term. So going back into 2014 or 15, it's been a very simple strategy of trying to turn Venezuela back to democracy. The formula has been also a bit simple. It's been to add in diplomatic and economic pressure, provide off-ramps for the regime, provide a democratic alternative, strengthen a democratic alternative, and then get to a transition and ultimately to a free and fair election. That simplistic formula, in the end, didn't take into account a lot of Venezuela's reality. One of the first things that I think we notice is that sanctions really can't work in isolation, that they have to be integrated with every other piece of the policy. And one of the big things that the US could bring to Venezuela, could bring to bear to this problem is sanctions. And it really has started to kind of show up the limits to sanctions. Again, a very kind of critical piece, not only for the hemisphere, but across the planet, because sanctions are increasingly becoming the U.S. kind of tool of choice when there's a frustration with a regime or with something. But there's real limits to what sanctions in the end can produce. The second thing is that the democratic forces, in this case, really frightened the military. So the center of gravity in Venezuela has always been the security forces. That's what allows the regime the ability to continue to rule. And they've got a very clever way of organizing those security forces. One of the things that came up kind of early on is they realized that if people went to the streets in large numbers, which they were in 2014 and 15, hundreds of thousands of protesters, the regime realized that if that continued to happen and they had to call out the military would refuse to shoot anybody. They were not going to get involved in some kind of a scrum in the streets. That just wasn't what they wanted to do. So the regime started to build all these other security forces around this mission of keeping the protesters at bay. They did that, would not have to call out the military, and that's kind of one of the things that, again, has allowed them to survive. The third thing is that nobody is really willing to use force. And our last administration liked to bluster about all options being on the table. I actually took one of those options off the table at one point. I was out in the front of the State Department, and there was this crowd that was Code Pink, I think they called themselves. They were really rallying against our Venezuela policy. They saw it as interventionist and whatnot. And one of them, in a moment of kind of real frustration, asked me if we would ever nuke Venezuela. And I said, well, no, just so you know, we will never nuke Venezuela. So anyway, that one tool I took off the table. But anyways, we blustered about having this policy, this very robust policy with all options on the table, and the president used that several times. But it just wasn't true. They knew that, and I think the Venezuelan elites were actually able to use that against us because they knew it wasn't true, so they really weren't at risk, but they could use that to say the gringos are after us, and it actually caused the regime in some ways to cohere. So some of the tools that we think we have or that we try to employ, they often either backfire or they're just used in a clumsy way that doesn't produce what it is that we would like to get to. So without anyone willing to use force, it wasn't going to be a Panama or a Grenada. The internal forces were all they had, and that was the mass demonstrations. Again, the regime had figured out ways to get around that, ways to allow them to kick off steam, but still not to be in a place where they were going to displace the regime. So that was always a little bit flawed. The fourth thing was the off-ramps. And we talked a lot about off-ramps in the period from 2015 and 16 up until quite recently. The idea was always that the outlet for all of this was that if the regime got to a point where it finally could no longer hang on, they would look for some kind of a way to go into exile. The regime never had that in mind, absolutely never. They were always intent on staying in Venezuela in any scenario. Even in a transitional scenario, they were intent on staying there. They were certainly not going off into exile. So the notion of off-ramps, we realized that at some point was probably the wrong piece of the strategy. It should have been on-ramps, where instead of getting to an all or nothing scenario where these guys get displaced and the new guys come in, what was really needed was a system of democratic coexistence where they both could survive. Now, it's, you know, you don't want to blame the victims. I mean, the opposition has clearly been advocating and trying to get to a place of democratic restoration and renewal. There's no question they're on the right side of that issue, but they approach it from a very, very harsh place, and they have no question that they want to displace the Chavistas and be done with them forever. So that kind of existential threat that they present, particularly to the military, has been very, I think, unhelpful in the long term in trying to develop a way out. The fifth thing is that it's always been reinforced, and again, we kind of fed into that. We, the United States, fed into an all or nothing construct. That again, there was no middle ground. There was not a place where you could see the survival of one side or the other. It was really a grudge match that was going to be all or nothing. And then finally, the question of the moderates in the regime. There was never a real good understanding of whether there were moderates in the regime that could be kind of accessed or could be empowered in a way that would lead them to kind of open up a process, if you will, of perestroika, some kind of a process where they would allow for some kind of a transition or a blended government or something like that. Now, that's been a key part of the shifts in the strategy in the last few months, and I'll talk about that in a second. So we're now in a place where the current situation is very interesting. You've got an interim government, which if you followed it a little over 2 years or just under 2 years ago, the United States supported Juan Guaido. He was the head of the National Assembly. And I remember when he came up in December of 2018. We were setting up meetings for him, very young guy, very switched on, very enthusiastic. But we were assuming that the National Assembly at that point was going to be nothing more than a continuation of this body that was not really taken seriously by the regime. They had tried to replace it with a constituent assembly. So a very kind of weakened body, and we assumed he would continue to take that on. But then this idea came out of somewhere that in the Constitution, the Venezuelan Constitution has this provision that if a president is not able to or is not in, I forget how it's phrased, but it's in such a way that you could argue that if a president is not legitimate, there's been a problem with the election or whatever, and he's not legitimate, then the president of the National Assembly takes over. So that was the ploy that was used to bring in Guaido and set up an interim government, as it was called. So for the past 2 years, there's been this interim government that has been playing out this drama of having an alternate government, basically, to the Maduro regime. Very interesting situation that we have found ourselves in, and 3 years now, I guess. Yeah, it's been 3 years. So they've been playing out this scenario of having an interim government that is set up alongside, if you will, the Maduro government. It's been a very creative thing, not something that's ever been done before, and it's one of the real unique exercises in statecraft that I think I've seen. It was never clear what the end state was, other than displacing Maduro and for these guys to take over. Again, the flaw kind of in the planning was not thinking through what happens if we don't displace Maduro and how long can this drag on with two different governments over the same, with a claim over the same country. So anyway, that's kind of the interim government now has kind of run its course in a way. They've lost popular support. They were at 65% a year ago. They're now down to about 12%. So the people have kind of lost interest in this. They saw this as a way they might get their country back. It didn't work out, and they're kind of losing interest in it. There's another big factor, and that's U.S. domestic politics. And in all of these issues, of course, there is a very strong component of U.S. domestic politics that's prominent. In Florida right now, you've not only got the small and vocal Cuban minority, but you now have a very strong and growing number of Colombians and Venezuelans. They are very right-leaning, and they are very anti-Maduro. They were very anti-Castro, anti-Diaz, anti-Cuba, and they are very much against any kind of compromise with these hardline regimes, with these communist regimes, very anti-socialist and all the rest. So that's it's a very small group, but they have no counterforce, and so they are able to appeal now to both sides. The Democrats were very traumatized by losing Florida in the last election, determined that that won't happen again. So they're cautious about doing anything that would be seen as placating Maduro. And that kind of does also close off a number of tools that might have been interesting to use in the realm of negotiation and relations between the United States and Venezuela. Also burned a little bit, of course, by the Obama-Cuba entreaties. So no political price in the US for doing nothing. But lots of risk for doing something if it doesn't turn out. Maduro also has his own domestic issues. He's in a place where he also has no real price for doing nothing. He doesn't have a big reason to risk. He's strong internally, but the one caveat to that is he knows he can't go on forever. And one of the guys that I find interesting is his son, Nicholas Jr. And Nicholas Jr. has made some indications that at his age and his generation, so the younger Chavistas, let's say the guys in their late 20s to mid 30s, they're looking at the things very differently than the Diosdado Cabellos, the real hardliners that are in their 60s, who are really just kind of, they want to hang on to the bitter end and then have a place where they're going to be safe and not go to the Hague to go to court or anything like that. But the younger generation is looking ahead and saying, you know, we've got the future ahead of us. And I think they're in a different place. I think that there are moderates that could be strengthened. It's a huge risk to do that, because if you try to strengthen the moderates, doesn't go well, then you end up giving things away for free. So there's a dance right now about what the U.S. can and should or cannot do in terms of trying to juice this process a little bit. I'll get into that in a second. So there's three big events that are in play right now. Where are we right now? So we have, you know, again, we're kind of coming up to the end of the Guaido interim government. We just had an election a few weeks ago. As everyone expected, it pretty much painted the map red in terms of the governorates. The Chavistas won all but 3 of the governorates. Now there's one that's going back up for a re-election in January. It wasn't a great process, but it was interesting to deal with civil society. And this is, again, part of the gray area of these conflicts. It's just not black and white. And I think that there's an effort a lot of times to try to oversimplify these things. But among civil society, they really said, look, we need to run this election because we're going to lose the ability to run elections if we don't juice the machinery a little bit. So they were actually quite interested in running it, and they were satisfied with how it came out. Now, on the mayoral cases, this was a local and regional election. It wasn't national. It wasn't for the assembly or the presidency. It was just mayors and governors. But the Democratic forces did win a lot of the mayors. They won about a third, 117. So it actually kind of turned out to be okay. But anyway, muddled through the election. Not a big catastrophe, not a great story, but it's done now. The next question is, will the negotiations return? There have been 3 rounds of negotiations. It's probably the most promising negotiations that they've had to date between the opposition and the government. Usually they end with a very abrupt, that's it, we're never coming back kind of a message. And now it's kind of muddling along. They've had 3 good rounds, and they've got another, they've been doing it in Mexico City. The Mexicans very good at hosting these sorts of things. And the Chavistas have said they're not coming back again. They do this periodically, but it looks like they probably will reconvene in January. Now, there's another factor there, and that is for the first time, 2 out of the 9 negotiators on each side are women. There's never been women negotiators before. Venezuela is kind of an odd country because it's very progressive in some ways, but extremely misogynistic in politics. There is a big question now about who represents the Venezuelan people in these talks. And so there's going to probably have to be some rejiggering if they come back in January. And then again, the third thing is what happens on January 5th with the interim government transition. The US has already said that they'll recognize Guaido again, but there's still some questions about how that plays out. So these 3 things playing out. In the end, it's a very complex situation. It's a populist authoritarianism, very hard to dislodge those. There's a need for non-kinetic tools. The United States doesn't have all the tools that it needs. Frankly, I think there's some tools that could be better developed on the US side. And it's, again, a reminder that in some cases, a political conflict could lead to conditions that are warlike in their indicators. So anyway, fascinating case. Happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. So let me move on to Colombia. I touched Colombia a number of times in my career. I was actually a Mormon missionary there in the late 70s. So that was my first touch with Colombia. And then I came back to it as an intelligence analyst in the early 90s. And then as the head of Andean affairs at the State Department in the 2016 to 18 range, and then worked on these peace programs from USIP now. So kind of hit it at different times in my career. I always tried to keep up with it. There's a chapter in my book about it that covers the full gamut of what happened in Colombia. To me, it's a remarkable story. My book is all about advocating, promoting peace building, but also nation building, which the president doesn't seem too crazy about that these days, but I will advocate that it is something that is still essential to US security, and that a world of failed and fragile states is really not a healthy world for America to try to manage issues like pandemics, terrorism, and economic struggles and all the rest. So I think the core of the nation state is still pretty fundamental to international security and to US prosperity. So I'm still advocating that it is something that we need to be able to do, and that we have done better than we often give ourselves credit for. And Colombia, I think, is one of the better examples. It really is probably the most successful, alongside the Balkans, of the different nation building adventures that we have been involved in over the last 40 years. But there's another dozen that are actually also good enough, frankly. So we're at the 5th anniversary of the peace talks now, which has kind of flown by pretty fast. I remember when the thing was signed between the FARC and the Santos government. It was really a remarkable achievement in a lot of ways. It gave the country some breathing room, allowed them to recover ungoverned territory. Kidnappings and violence went down. Refugees returned home. If you remember, Colombia at one point had the highest number of internal refugees in the world, 6 million or something. It was some extraordinary number. A fifth of the country, a sixth of the country was internal refugees. So they returned home, and then the cost of the war, of course, went way down. They had a war tax for quite a while, so the cost went down. The formula for making peace in Colombia was one that would be hard to replicate in many other countries, because there were just some unique things about Colombia. But it was a series of very effective security operations. I think in an insurgent conflict like that, there's no substitute for an effective security force that can go out and surgically, if you will, go after the insurgent forces, the guerrilla forces, and start to really corner them. There was a real skilled set of negotiations that included really significantly Cuba. The role of Cuba can't be left out. They had a very key role to play, both in hosting the talks and in coming on the side of peace. And then we, of course, at the right time, came in with some skilled negotiators on the American side as well. The government really also took advantage of the fatigue that the country was feeling, and that the insurgents themselves were starting to just get tired. There was very good U.S. support through Plan Colombia. That was, again, kind of a model for, I think, how these things could be done. It was also bipartisan on the part of the United States. So you had support from both Republicans and Democrats that was lasting. It was persistent. There also was kind of an acceptance that there needed to be a prioritization. This kind of came out in a negative way in the end for the United States, but there was a sense at some point that we needed to obsess a little bit less about counter-narcotics and a little bit more about peace. There was also a blend of soft and hard power, which is unusual for the United States to have that kind of a blend of hard and soft power that's so effective and so seamless. And then finally, there was just a lot of will and leadership on the Colombian side. Again, that's something that's hard to replicate. You get it when you get it, but it was very fortunate between the administrations of Uribe and Santos, both of which are controversial in their own way, and I accept that. But they had very good and consistent leadership, and the will of the Colombian people was just quite compelling throughout. So ending the war was actually the easy part. We're now into the phase of securing the peace, and it is just extremely hard. So one of the first things is the price tag for securing the peace is really sort of off the charts. You've got, again, a war tax got them through the worst of the war, but they were not in a position to maintain that level of taxation on the business community going forward. So there's a price tag for peace that is just difficult to meet. And that goes to this whole question of establishing government presence in the countryside. If you look at it, when the FARC got started way back in the 60s, it was a 50-year civil war. So our 20-year forever war in Afghanistan was actually modest by comparison to what the Colombians have been through. But the effective government presence in the countryside is just hard to get to. There's not an infrastructure for it. It's often getting government into places that are very sparsely populated. So there's a lot to that was just difficult. And again, the price tag was always going to be hard. And then you have the ELN and the dissident FARC that have still not come in from the cold. So you've still got about 15,000 fighters out there that are continuing the struggle and quite effective in some parts of the country. So you've got continuing problems with violence in these areas, and also the counter violence that comes from the right wing. They're not paramilitaries the way they used to be, but the right wing forces or the right wing small groups that are a kind of a counter to these dissident FARC and ELN, and even just social workers and human rights workers and others, environmental workers and things like that. And then finally, you had Venezuela, of course, get hit with refugees from Venezuela. Colombia get hit with refugees from Venezuela, about 1.7 million. COVID and then street protests. So there's been, these kind of waves of things that hit them just as they were starting to find their footing after the war. They get hit with some of these new things that have made everything more difficult. So moving forward, just to close the Colombia chapter here, the U.S.-Colombia partnership really is the key to the future. It's going to be critical to maintaining and sustaining the peace that has been so hard fought. The United States has a kind of a problem with this because when we end a war, we like to just say the war is over and move on. And that was the thing that got our attention. So maintaining the U.S. attention on this is a little bit challenging. The U.S. has sustained fairly high levels of funding for Colombia. And again, it's been a very, I think, creative mix of funding between development and other infrastructure and things related to the development of small businesses and other economic opportunities, and the hard side things in the security forces. You've got probably a leftist government that'll be coming in 2022. It looks like Petra is going to probably win next year. Now that's going to be a real mix of things, but on the one hand, you'll have an opportunity, I think, for the first time to actually have a viable negotiation with the ELN. The ELN's in a weird place, though, because they're a little bit emboldened because of the street protests. I think they felt like that kind of validated, we were the ones that were saying this all along, that socioeconomically, the country's in a bad place. So they kind of feel a little bit emboldened. Not entirely clear how soon they're going to be willing to give that up as a movement, but I think a Petra government would certainly have the ability to do that probably a little bit better than the current Duque government. The socioeconomic issues have really hit hard, and this is a broader theme that I'll talk about in a second about the whole hemisphere. But there is this question about what is the right socioeconomic model for a place like Colombia. The neoliberal model, the extractive model of resources has almost kind of run its course. And there's a big piece of that is still kind of hanging out there about what is the right socioeconomic model for the country. Again, we can talk about that in the Q&A if we're interested. And then part of that, of course, is police reform as well. With the waves of protests, there was a realization that the police were just not really set up for something like that. There's also a question about, when are you at a place where it's as good as it gets? And I think some of these countries, as frustrating as it might be, you get to a place where that's kind of as good as it's going to get in a country with the tough geography, the tough history, and all the things that go along with it. And then finally, the thought that I always have about Colombia is the same as with El Salvador and Guatemala, which I'll talk about now, is that there's the post-war, which everyone obsesses about. We got to get everybody demobilized and then collect up all the weapons and maybe do a little land reform. But then there's the post-war. There's that continuation of a very long phase of consolidating the economic and the political gains that were made in the peace process. And I talk about that in my book a lot, but there's this long process, and we're usually not set up for that, for a 20-year process, a 30-year process to consolidate the gains of a peace process. So that's something that I think is starting to play out a little bit in Colombia, and the reason why it's some of it is starting to unravel a bit. So let me close for a few minutes, just talk about Central America. Central America is I've done a couple things there. I was a military advisor in El Salvador in the 80s, training their army, and then I'm in Honduras. I was also an advisor in one of the training bases that we had up on the coast. And then I went back to El Salvador in the mid 90s to be an officer in the embassy. So I had kind of this ability to see how the war had turned out that I had worked on earlier. So that's been kind of an interesting trajectory. There's a lot of things I would not have predicted. I would not have predicted that Honduras would have gone the direction that it has. Honduras was always a very sleepy place. Not a lot of land pressure the way you had in El Salvador, just not the kind of traditional conflicts that both El Salvador and Guatemala had. A very quiet place, and has really become this churn for urban violence and a real polarizing kind of political situation. So these are also, I would say, kind of gray zone conflicts. They're not outright insurgencies anymore, but high levels of violence and criminal gangs that have taken over certain governing functions in neighborhoods, and certainly are empowered. In El Salvador, when they demobilized 8,000 insurgents. There's now about 60,000 gang members. So you've had, again, this transition from what was a shooting war and insurgency to what is a much more nebulous kind of conflict. Again, the post conflict, El Salvador's civil war was 79 to 92, Guatemala's 1960 to 96, but the post war was going to last decades, and that's where we are now. And there's a kind of a question of the real unconsolidated nature of these nations. I talk about this a lot in the book, about the nature of the nation state, that the nation is kind of that emotional, I feel close to this piece of territory that I live in, and I feel like this is my national home. We share a common language, we share a common vision. And then the state is the thing that goes out and brings that vision to life by providing all the services that the state institutions provide. These have both been weak throughout Central America. I tell the story in the book about a trip I made to the San Salvador Zoo once with this youth group that I mentored, and there was this one kid that saw this bear that had just had all the fat burned off its body because they couldn't feed it, and just looked totally forlorn. And he looked at that bear and he just looked up at me and he said, "Hermano Mines, este país no sirve." Brother Mines, this country just doesn't function. And I thought it was a little harsh because they were coming out of the Civil War. They had a whole lot of things to do. Maybe feeding the bear in the zoo wasn't the biggest thing for them. But I guess his point was, if we can't even feed the animals in the zoo, we got a big problem. It was that frustration, I think, and that's been the roiling frustration, I think, in all three of these countries for the last decades, is a country that didn't quite come together. El Salvador is in a weird place now with Bukele, so using this polarizing populism frustration with governance, with violence and corruption, to galvanize the people, and is starting to care less about democracy and more about order. People are kind of going along with that, closing the space that we've had traditionally with the United States in what was a very good relationship. China's kind of coming in on its own and filling in some of the gaps. He doesn't quite cross the line to do things too far, but he's coming about as close as he can. Honduras, again, from a very quiet to a very royal state now, but the election over the weekend was quite good. Look at our piece on the USIP website, very good piece that one of my colleagues wrote about the election. We're always kind of the glass half full crowd in Washington, entity in Washington, and we try to see things as maybe an opportunity is there. So we'll see how that comes out. But again, the violence and the gangs is just persistent, and it's been hit by this succession even more than the other two of climate events. So Honduras being right in the middle of the isthmus, it just gets hit more by climate events even than El Salvador and Guatemala. Guatemala gets hit in a different way, but Honduras kind of bears the brunt. So a real challenged place. Again, we'll see how things go with the new president, left-leaning president now, but with some baggage from the United States because of us supporting the coup against her husband 10 years ago. And Guatemala, naturally polarized, just a place where polarization is built into the country, linguistic as well as cultural. Again, the war ended, but never quite cohered and never quite solved some of the underlying issues that led to war in the first place. And the same kind of weaknesses are being exploited now by clever political leaders as in the other two countries. So also a very difficult place. So the themes, just to close, these are themes that I'm key to Central America, but they're really kind of throughout the hemisphere right now. This issue of polarization and the question of using polarization as a political tool, painting certain groups as the other, the enemy, the way Bukele does. The NGOs are all part of the enemy. That's the enemy of our country. A very kind of deliberate polarization of the country, of the kind that Chavez was just an expert at. The second thing is a reduced belief in democracy. Democracy is decreasingly valued in many countries in the hemisphere. They're ready for something, a stronger hand. The third is the role of the security forces, which are have been out of politics in many countries. El Salvador, US trained force, and they stayed out of politics for 3 full decades, have now been brought back into politics by Bukele. But the security forces at the end of the day are always going to be one of the key players. And again, their adherence to democratic norms, their belief in democracy is getting a little bit questionable. The fourth thing is there's a question that's always hanging out there of a national dialogue, and how do citizens dialogue with their leaders? I mean, it should be coming up through the Congresses, but the parliaments, but that doesn't really work. They're not really switched on to an extent that people feel comfortable like I'm being represented. So national dialogue is a question that I think needs work, and is something that that is kind of just hanging out there as an unfinished issue that needs to get better. And then the final thing is socioeconomic models. I think there's a sense where a lot of people feel like the neoliberal model, unrestrained, has sort of run its course, that it consolidated a good macroeconomic framework for most of Latin America. You look back in the 70s with the debt crisis and the really horrible macroeconomic frameworks that many Latin American countries, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, the 3 biggest ones, that really got hit hard because they just didn't have the right framework of their economies. So they fixed those things. And then the whole hemisphere kind of got excited about the Chilean model and the neoliberal model. But it retained the really high levels of income disparity that are a part of the hemisphere. So you kind of have that retained in there. And I think we're to a point where there is a search for a new socioeconomic model. I've been pitching the German model to the Chavistas that I know, and the question is always, can you have the German model without Germans? I'm not sure. But something where there's a high level of a social safety net, but also a highly productive private sector is probably the right model. Again, that's a very difficult one to get to. And when you go too far to the left to try to capture something like that in a weak political system, then all hell can break loose as it did in Venezuela. But I think there's issues out there, national dialogues, socioeconomic models, police reform. There's a lot of big issues that are in play right now. Well, let me end there. I actually went a little further than I should have, but let me end there, and we can focus back in on some of the issues that you're interested in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Keith. You covered an extraordinary amount of ground, and it's great. So there's a lot to talk about. We have a number of questions here from the audience. I'll just go straight to one of them from our colleague Ryan Shaw. You mentioned the unique combination of hard and soft power being a factor in success in Colombia. Is there anything we can learn from that experience that could be institutionalized and transferable to other contexts? It seems like we do this very poorly most of the times. Does USIP advocate for any policy or structural changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a lot in the book about this. I actually have a discount flyer for the book. If anyone's interested, we can maybe send that around afterwards. I can give you 50%.
In fact, let's do that.
Okay.
We'll send that on all our lists.
Okay. But the thing that I note in there is the one that the president that actually did this quite well was Reagan. Reagan was very seized. If you look back in the Central America program of the 80s, I mean, he's seen as this hard ass that just wants to go around cracking heads. That's really not true. I mean, there was the Kissinger Commission to try to get to a better development model. There was tariff reduction so that products would come into the United States. There was some really creative stuff. So I think that was, to me, the president that probably did it the best. Clinton also, I think, actually understood the whole blending of hard and soft power and did that quite well in the Balkans, which was, if you think about it, we got in and out of the Balkans with one casualty, and that was a non-battle casualty, and pacified a whole region that was roiling in conflict. So I think we have done this better at times than others, but I think Ryan's right. It's not natural and it's not built into our system. I think we did it very poorly in Afghanistan and Iraq, along with one other key thing, and that was just ignoring the need to consolidate the political gains of war when the war is over. That was the thing. This is the Nadia Shadlow thesis. She's written extensively about this, but it was such an obvious thing that we have always done, and somehow post 9/11 we had this fantasy that we could just knock off governments and not worry about it, but that's not built into our system, and there's whole pieces of the system that are missing. So, from the State Department, the political part is not really ingrained, and there's a lot of that needs work. Absolutely.
A question here from Ryan Krasinski. Would you agree that the prospect of democracy building and nation building needs focus less on virtue and more on physical results of improvement within a country's infrastructure? Considering China's proactive approach at building the infrastructure of countries in Africa, for example.
So I am actually a kind of a fan of the virtue part, I guess. I think that the institutions and the structure of the nation are super important. The thing that I try to stress is in the book is the need for political consolidation even before some of the economic stuff starts. We had a big debate in Iraq about, can we start in with a proper neoliberal framework in the transitional period? And this is the same thing that happened in Haiti in the mid-90s. And there was a sense that we've got to get them on the right economic track, the right economic framework. They've got to, get rid of the state-owned enterprises and have a good economic framework so everybody comes in and invests. And I think that was a real mistake in both those cases, because what they really needed was just employment. They needed full employment during the transitional period, so that when they got when the political process finally settled, then they could move on to some of the harder economic reforms. That was actually the model that Hungary followed post-communist. They went two administrations where they left all the state-owned enterprises alone. And then it was actually the socialists that came in and ran the Bokros plan, where they really hit the economy hard. It was kind of odd that it was the socialists that did that. But anyway, that was kind of the model, was let the political piece settle first and then do the economic reform. I guess that's not quite lined up with the question. But the question, I think, is, again, I would say that getting that political consolidation right is the first thing, and the economics supports that, but it needs to just be in a supportive function rather than some of the hard-nosed reforms that we often put countries through, maybe at a time when they're not ready for that. Now, the question about China and the question about whether because we are competing with China in a lot of these places, a lot of these situations. They have, a certain model that they're trying to impose. It's basically the Vietnamese model, where you would have a kind of authoritarian state, but but a free market. And some countries are just slow to pick up on that. Again, the Venezuelans have been very slow to embrace that. But the question of the building and the infrastructure and things like that, I think they kind of have to go hand in hand with a political system that is cohering and that is consolidating. But that earlier question is right, that if the economic piece is not there to support it, and there's too much hardship, then it's hard for people to get behind a political process. But I would try to put them, I think, lined up with the ultimate goal being that political consolidation.
A question here from colleague Dale Rogers. I'm a supply chain professor, and we recently published a piece in the Harvard Business Review that calls for an America's manufacturing solution that capitalizes on cheap and plentiful labor in Central America and Mexico to counter the pivoting of China away from the US and the China Belt and Road solution. Would an America's solution that leverages Central America and perhaps Northern South America to move in the direction of replacing Chinese and Asian manufacturing and logistics be viable in
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, leave the question up so I don't lose the thread here. That one of the things when I spent 4 years in Mexico running the Merida Initiative, which is kind of Plan Colombia for Mexico, and we had a very switched on ambassador at the time, Carlos Pascual. He had this idea that one of the answer to both China and the EU was for North America to become this very integrated economic bloc, which it's not now. We've got a certain level of integration, and obviously we're not going to get to the level of the EU, but there's a long ways to go. And I remember one of the things that came up is I went to Lázaro Cárdenas port a couple times because we had a port security program there. So that's one of the ports on the Pacific. And the Kansas City Southern Railroad, Kansas City something, they're one of the railroads that has Kansas City in the title. I remember that because I come from Kansas City. Anyway, they were trying to get a project going whereby in the port, the idea was that Chinese goods would come to Lázaro Cárdenas, load onto American trains, and flow right up into the heartland of the United States. It's interesting now because of what's going on in Long Beach, but they made the point back then that Lázaro Cárdenas is closer to Chicago than Los Angeles is, which is kind of weird, but if you look at the map, it's actually Kansas City Southern. That's it. Yeah. Okay. This was a few years ago. Thanks. But it was a very clever idea. So their idea was, again, the stuff comes in, it shoots through Mexico right up into the United States. So that was one example. Pascual was all over this idea that the economic bloc has just got to be better integrated. And so there was this whole question about, can you seal trains in Mexico, get them inspected really early, and then they shoot right up into America. The question was always came out when you looked at the logistics of car manufacturing. And it was some stunning number of times that a part crosses a border to get a car built in North America, because you've got pieces being built in all three countries, cars assembled in one country, but the components are coming in and the components go to get assembled in one country and come back down or whatever. So yeah, I think there's a lot that could be done there, and I think we the North America have been very uncreative in this, and unfortunately, it's getting worse between fear of drug trafficking and migration. But there's a lot that could be done there, and I think Dale's got it right. I think there's a lot that could be done, and it would fix a lot of the other issues as well. It would provide that employment that's missing in Central America. So there's been some creative efforts at this, but they've never really been consolidated, coordinated, comprehensive. And again, I think politically there's still just this fear of losing what little manufacturing we have left. But I think it's a very good point.
Another question is one of the pressing issues. Let's just focus on Central America for a moment, but this is true in other parts of Latin America as well. Is the depth and destructive quality of institutionalized corruption as regards trust in any governing system, or even the capacity of governing systems to be responsive to the citizenry. since the great drivers of a lot of access to power and wealth have little to do with, effective governance.
Yeah, corruption is the one thing throughout Central America, obviously, that comes up almost first. It's just pervasive. It's almost accepted in some ways, and it's so thorough, and it gets right down to every block of every street. I mean, there's nobody that avoids some of the impact of corruption. There's been a number of interesting programs that have been tried. Of course, the two commissions in Honduras and Guatemala that were actually quite effective at fighting corruption, and then corrupt actors.
SIG in Guatemala, for example.
SIG in Guatemala, yeah. And
will that come back?
I don't think so. I mean, it's a good question, but I don't think so. I mean, they were first degraded and then kicked out. Now, it's not our fault, but part of this, we were very indifferent to them leaving. So there were U.S. policy choices that, in my opinion, were not that clever, where we kind of let that go. And some of that, the democratization stuff, I mean, it is, we don't have the example we used to have where we could be a little more forceful on these things. And I think the jostling in our own political system right now is not helpful in our being able to do these things. And it didn't help that, we had a Secretary of State in 2016 that very clearly said to the State Department, we are not interested in the internal affairs of other countries. And it was very odd to most of us that most of our careers had been spent being concerned about the internal affairs of other countries when they were involved in things like genocide, human rights abuses, corruption, you name it. So that was a bit of a sea change, and it weakened, I think, the ability of the United States to be effective in as a voice for some of these things, and just made everything a little bit more difficult. So, but yeah, the corruption issue is pervasive. I think it'll be interesting to look at. It's going in two directions, because the technology of anti-corruption is actually advancing pretty aggressively. There's the new eye scan technology, which is very interesting. A couple of professors at University of Utah developed this eye scan, which is so much easier to apply than a polygraph, to pick up just minor corruption among officials. And that's something that kind of opened the door to a whole new potential process for curtailing corruption. So there's technological things that are on the good side, but politically, it's just everything's gotten worse. The incentive for governments to try to root out corruption are not there the way they used to be. Again, we just don't quite have the ability to persuade governments in some ways that we would have 5 or 10 years ago.
One final question. During different periods of time, one of the most profound delegitimizing discourses for the authoritarian regimes that used to be dominant in Latin America was human rights. And I'm wondering now, with all of these various shifts and changes, to what degree does the discourse, the fundamental principles, and the various mechanisms of human rights in the Americas play a role in the work you're doing at USIP and any vision for how things might improve in the region?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the issues that there's a lot of focus on now is femicides, just the violence against women, gender-based violence, particularly in Central America, which is among the worst in the world, and other parts of the hemisphere as well. We have some programs on that we try to do, what we can, finger in the dike kind of stuff. But one of the human rights issues that I find interesting in Venezuela, the biggest human rights violation there is just bad governance. And, it's not even the security forces and the conventional ways that we think about, torture, killing, and imprisonment, but it's just the bad economic policy, the bad governance that has led to people now being hungry and 7 million people leaving the country. So just that the cruelness of a regime that is indifferent to its people. And Nicaragua kind of similar, it's just the indifference to the people in the interest of a small elite that has found itself in this dead end and doesn't know how to get out of it. So there's those large scale human rights issues that would be much improved just by changing the governance structure, getting to a place of a better economic policy and better governance. So that's one of the things that I think about often. The kind of conventional problems that we've had throughout, for the last 40 years, a lot of them really have gotten much better. You look back on the situation in the Southern Cone and the countries that were fighting insurgencies and the horrible human rights violations that went along with that, like Peru. So there's a lot of places where it's gotten better, but I think again now we're in this other situation where these bad economic and political systems lead to something. Again, it's a little bit like the non-shooting war, where it's not a war, but it's warlike conditions. In this case, it's not overt human rights violations, but it is certainly something that creates the conditions that in some ways are even worse.
Thank you so much, Keith Mines. Thank you all of everyone who's joined us tonight. We appreciate your time, and we're thrilled to be able to share Keith's expertise with all of you. So have a great evening, and a special thanks also to Matt Oxford for helping to put all of this together logistically. And we wish all of you the very best.
Thanks, everybody.